Now we're talking. Live. Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's having a wonderful morning. I just want to say hi to my guest here, Dacre Stoker. He's an amazing guy. And I want to do a shout out to my group, my crew, and my cast of Halloween Evil Lives, the fan film. And we also, Dacre would like to give a special shout out to my co-host.
I know, Tiffany. Sorry you couldn't be here. This is, maybe a little early for you. Maybe you're still in the grave, in your native soil. I don't know if you're one of my kind of people, but Michael and I are up. So sorry to miss you, but we're thinking of you.
Yes, we are. And with that, I introduce you Dacre Stoker, the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, who wrote one of the most popular novels in the world, Dracula. Here he is.
Yeah,
welcome.
Thanks. Absolutely, it's great. The Halloween season, it's a time everybody thinks about Dracula. I'm thinking about Dracula year round, along with a couple of co-authors. Ian Holt wrote Dracula the Undead, and more recently, J.D. Barker, Dracul. So it's like if I'm not writing it, I'm researching it or thinking about it, because, most importantly, I'm trying to think of Bram Stoker. Whoop, here he is over here. This is my great-granduncle, who is a guy that's kind of been overshadowed by his creation, and I'm trying to change that, trying to let people understand a little bit more about what went into writing Dracula, some of his inspiration, some of his motivation, what his research, where it took him, what he found in the books, what's in his notes that live in the Rosenbach Museum. There's even a typescript that Paul Allen's estate, the fellow that was a co-founder of Microsoft, owns that, and J.D. Barker and I were able to analyze that to help us in our fictional world. So, yeah, Michael, this is the time we kind of, everybody focuses on, but I do it year round. I'm even wearing a Dracula early editions tie that has a result of a lot of my digging around in archives and meeting people that have loaned me, give me permission to put their early edition Dracula on a necktie. So great to be here.
People don't realize that
questions.
Without Dracula, there wouldn't be Michael Myers or Jason. It opened the door to the monster universe. That novel became a movie, a play, then a movie, and that opened, the door to modern horror. Because there wasn't much anything like that back then.
Well, we got to give credit to Frankenstein. Let's put it in perspective. So Dracula was written between 1890 and published in 1897, but in 1817, Mary Shelley, Percy Byron, Lord Byron, went off to Lake Geneva for a writer's retreat / holiday, along with some others. John Polidori, Byron's doctor, came along. And I think of this often, this kind of retreat, because that was ground zero for sort of what we know as Gothic literature. And this really strange thing happened. A year earlier in Indonesia, a massive volcano erupted, and the dust cloud traveled around the world, much like it actually happened in Iceland, I think about 10 years ago, which, those volcanoes happen. There's one happening right now in Spain. But what we don't realize is that what happens somewhere on this planet, when the dust cloud travels around, it affects weather. It shuts out the sun. Even back in the early 1800s, I've checked the Farmer's Almanac. The weather patterns in America, North America, was affected big time. We had crops had problems because we didn't have sun. This was such a huge event. So these guys in Lake Geneva went there to escape the British sort of summer, which is drizzly all the time. They had darkness, they had rain. They couldn't go outside and play. So essentially what they ended up doing was staying indoors and challenging each other to write a horror story. And at that gathering, Mary Shelley started Frankenstein, and Byron did a little bit of writing a vampire story. He put it down. His doctor, now in those days, they traveled with doctors in case somebody got injured. They couldn't just rush out to a nearby hospital or urgent care. His doctor, John Polidori, actually continues writing this and finishes the story. And there's a saga that goes with that. that Byron actually had it published and took credit for it, and Polidori had to get it back, and there was a lawsuit. But that's where, as I say, Frankenstein was created, but the first vampire story in English literature started there. There's mentions of other vampires earlier on, vampire scares, treaties, and so on, but this is literature. So that's where it started. And then two other books, another Irish writer, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, wrote a story called Carmilla. That was about a female vampire. And then J. Malcolm Reimer wrote Varney the Vampire, which was what they call a penny dreadful, inexpensive paperback. So those all predated my Uncle Bram. But what Bram did, well, we actually believe, looking at his notes, that he kind of was following along with Le Fanu a little bit, because he was planning to set at least part of his story in Styria, which was a province of what became Austria. And that's where Carmilla was set. So it looks like fellow Irishmen got the motivation from fellow Irishmen, and set the story there, because Bram had recognized there was already a lot of existing real vampire lore in Styria.
Oh yeah, it's bad there in Poland and Hungary. Yeah,
exactly. When he went to Whitby in England, he found other sources of where vampires were. He found this book by Emily Gerard called Land Beyond the Forest. He also was in the London Library, and he found that same book there. And that's, together with the allure of the Gothic atmosphere in Whitby and the shipwrecks and the information he got from all of the Coast Guard and the rescue crews, he changed his location from Styria to Transylvania, and from boat landing in Dover to landing in Whitby. And we say the rest is history. So, Bram did have a hand in starting it, but he didn't start everything. And his novel, was pretty popular. There was a lot of reviews. So a lot of people say, oh, it was met with mixed reviews. Wasn't very popular, but a friend of mine, Dr. John Edgar Browning, has done a lot of research, and there was more than just a few negative reviews. There was a lot of very popular reviews, but what it did basically scared the heck out of people, because
it was a shocking
story. Yeah, right. It was shocking. It was set in real time. The book was set, even though it was written and published in 1897, it was set in 1893. So it was set in real time, in real places. Bram used real people. He took names actually off of tombstones, real life people, based his characters on, sometimes merged characteristics of people to make real people characters in the story. So he made the thing so darn real that's what was so shocking. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you're right, it went on to stage after Bram died in 1912. It went on to stage when Hamilton Dean and John Balderston introduced Bela Lugosi. It had actually been in England as well before Lugosi got involved. And then 1922, the Nosferatu knockoff, which was a copyright infringement, but that, brought fame to it, as did the 1931 Todd Browning movie produced by Universal, and of course Bela Lugosi. And as we see, the rest just keeps on going.
A lot of people don't know that there's a rich vampire folklore in Ireland where Bram grew up. The Fae are actually vampiric creatures themselves. Could you explore that with us a little bit? Tell us about what you discovered there in Ireland about the vampire tales.
Well, I got to say, in my early research and when I was younger, I thought, geez, this is my heritage. Bram Stoker is my great-granduncle, but his youngest brother was my great-grandfather, George. And George had a son that came over to Canada. So, my dad was second generation, and I'm third, and I'm proud of that heritage. But I didn't know a whole lot about what was really going on in Irish folklore, mythology, and superstition. I always thought, leprechauns, the rainbow, the gold, the pot of gold, the Notre Dame mascot, all that's cool. But as I started looking into it, it's pretty gruesome. Essentially, we've got what we call cautionary tales, and there's more than just their versions of vampires. There's banshees, there's pukas, there's changelings, and the fairies are not the little Tinkerbell fairies. These are
they're not
creatures that do warn of the death. As I said, they're cautionary tales. If and they kind of get kids and adults, behave properly, do the right thing, and you'll be all right. But if you succumb to, the farmer's daughter or somebody else's wife, you're going to be in deep trouble. And that's essentially boiling down
Basically boogeyman, the
it's
original
a
boogeyman.
You're absolutely right. And this is what, I'm sure this is what Bram was exposed to. We don't have written records, but I have oral ones passed down through the family. Bram does have great-grandsons still alive. They were raised by Bram's son himself, and they said, yeah, he was told all kinds of stories by his mother. Bram passed them on down to his son, and it was all these tales of vampiric creatures. J.D. Barker and I actually found the Dare-Do in some of the Irish books, and that was what we inserted into Dracul as a story that makes a lot of sense for introducing one of the things that introduced Bram to the vampire. We also found that interesting connection. Oscar Wilde's mother and Bram were quite close. Oscar Wilde had an older brother that Bram Stoker went to school with, and of course Oscar was dating the lady that Bram ended up marrying. But Oscar Wilde's mother was really into literature, and she encouraged people. She had these sort of what they call salons, gatherings at her house where they would talk about poetry and writing and different ideas about writing. And in absence of Bram's father being supportive of Bram's writing, he went off. This is when he was in university and also working at Dublin Castle in a very boring job as a civil servant. He went off to these salons and talked literature. She wrote a book about Irish superstition and mythology where she mentioned Emily Gerard's book about Transylvanian superstitions, and she mentioned that the Transylvanian superstitions were very similar to Irish superstitions and folklore. And Michael, that could have been one of the early triggers for Bram Stoker, turning on to Transylvania, looking up Emily Gerard's book about superstitions and so on. Something early in his life that, 10, 15 years later, when he started doing his research, that rang a bell. So yeah, Irish mythology and folklore, horrifying, not the...
Yeah, they would rip the people apart, the fairies. They weren't very friendly at all.
No, there was definitely, as we say, do the right thing and you'll stay clear of the fairies. And I will say, look, man, we've just come out of the Halloween season. Halloween all started, Samhain was this pagan ritual of a changing of the seasons where the days become longer, the night starts earlier, and they say that one night, All Hallows Eve, that one night, Samhain, is when the veil is lifted between the living and the dead. So people were encouraged to, put on costumes to disguise themselves. So when the dead come back, they're not going to take them to the underworld, so to speak. Lots of cool rituals, but we've got to hand it to the Irish. They brought to North America.
They did the tulip, not the pumpkin, folks. They would light up tulips.
Turnip. So they didn't have pumpkins there, and we didn't have turnips or as many turnips in America. So it was an easy transformation to have the turnip become the pumpkin. The jack-o'-lantern, was the lantern that was supposed to guide the devil and keep him away from you. So the jack-o'-lantern, the turnips, the costumes, and all kinds of other cool old superstitions that have been modernized, but thanks to Ireland. And we got to thank Bram Stoker and Dracula, because without those types of early superstitions, we wouldn't have had Dracula. And as you say, we wouldn't have had Michael Myers and everything else, because he's
everything
inspired
spawned from that.
Yeah, a generation of people to get into horror and so on.
What did you find out about the origins of the vampire, the nonfiction? As you know, about Mercy Brown, and you talk a lot about that, about the Rhode Island vampires, New England vampire scare that Bram Stoker found some newspaper clippings on.
Absolutely. So, it starts with stuff that he found, that we know he found, because he gave one interview. And that one interview was in the British weekly newspaper by a lady called Jane Stoker. And she said, where did you get this? Where did you find this information? What fascinated you about this? And he talked about the threat of the vampire, the scare of the vampire depopulated many villages. He then mentioned, I think, 13 countries where he found evidence of folklore and treaties where vampirism was sort of going on, let's say suspected. So I dug into those same libraries where he was in. They had some treaties there. And essentially what these were, that was the late 1600s and 1700s, when these diseases were going through Europe, the plague, cholera, other diseases like this. And what he was finding was people would not understand why the diseases were so, potent, why they were being passed on so quickly. So here's an example. And as I said, I found these treaties. You can find them online too. Cal May is one of them. Van Swieten is one of them. But essentially, one of the more famous ones, and we'll get to America in a moment, but still I'm going to be stuck in Europe for a bit, that a guy called Philip Rohr found a mass grave in Venice, Italy. And because Italy, has such a high water table, this mass grave of 400 bodies couldn't be dug too deep. So it was a shallow grave, a big pit. And it was common when there were these diseases, and there was a plague at the time, and all these bodies stuck into one grave. They were so scared of touching the body, they didn't have the normal funerals and so on. So they shoved them all in the grave, and they'd put lime or some other disinfectant, if they had it, dirt in the bodies. But since these folks didn't really understand the decomposition process of the body, as these bodies would decompose and the skin and the muscle tissue would fall apart, fall off, the jaws would close, the bodies would shift, the skeletons would make a crunching noise. So as they heard, because it's a shallow grave, on the top, not underground, as these living people heard strange crunching noises underneath the dirt, they assumed that something was going on down there. And they also put two and two together, sometimes, most of the time, not accurately, that the deaths of people on the surface were being caused by the spirits or these bodies coming out of the grave. So they would exhume the grave, and they would find these bodies partially decomposed, but red stuff around the burial shroud. And that they assumed, wrongly of course, that these bodies and that crunching noise was these bodies trying to chew their way out of the grave, or they'd come out, suck the blood of the living, cause the living to die, go back into the grave and have red around them, and therefore the bloated stomach. So what would they do? As Philip Rohr noticed in his treatise, they'd shove a brick into the mouth of the skeleton to stop it from chewing its way out. So that was, and Michael, that's an example of what Bram found in many places. Military doctors were sent out because they were the most learned people at the time. The church or the royal families were sending out these military medical doctors to find out what the heck is going on, as you mentioned, in Poland, in Hungary, in Serbia, these different places that were like isolated places that were said to have a vampire scare, and they were exhuming bodies to stake them into the ground or take their heads off, all that stuff.
Burn the body.
Exactly. All these rituals were kind of rooted in this misconception of communicable diseases. Now, you asked the question, which I'll finally now answer. What did Bram know about this, particularly in America? In his notes for Dracula that live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. Highly recommend you check them out if sometimes. They have been published by Elizabeth Miller and Robert Basang. I don't know if they're still in print, but I've seen copies on eBay, used books, and so on. They're really cool because you see exactly what Bram was looking at, his notes, where they ended up in the novel. They also include, as Michael said, a newspaper clipping from the New York World newspaper from 1896. And that was a respected newspaper. It was reporting on the New England vampire scare. What was happening? Well, in New England, there was over 50 state-approved exhumations in these different New England states. What was happening? Tuberculosis. another communicable disease that people didn't understand how it was transmitted. What were the signs of it? People would have these fevers, their body would waste away, they'd cough up blood, they'd wake up in the middle of the night with these sort of delusionary nightmares of somebody sitting on their chest because their chest was feeling like it was pushed in, and there would be blood all coughed up. So the living would think, oh gosh, somebody is coming out of the grave, sucking the blood out of some of my family. We've got to go to the grave, just like our relatives did a couple hundred years ago, exhume the body. And they had a number of rituals. Michael, you know exactly what they are, as I do. Yeah. What did they do to the body of Mercy Brown, Sarah Tillinghast, and so on?
They would they remove the heart, they would burn it, and then turn it into an elixir. And it was supposed to become a cure for tuberculosis because it's, but I don't see, that's the thing. Family member after family member would die because they would get the virus or the disease to each other, assuming that the other person was returning from the grave and feeding on them, and to stop it, they tried to make the drink all the heart.
And it's interesting. I was actually on a show called Legend Hunter, and what right now the guy's his name eludes me. Pat Spain? Pat Spain.
I saw that episode.
Yeah, it was so cool. He's a microbiologist, so he was introducing the idea and floating it to me about, do you think what he's looking at is scientific evidence for all these legends, and he's trying to figure out about this vampire scare and how potentially this ritual of taking the heart out, burning it at the crossroads, turning it into a potion, and feeding it to living to ward off the vampirism. In this case, they were actually taking a heart of somebody who had tuberculosis, burning it and feeding it to the person. It was a lot. And what his theory was, and I think it's an interesting theory to look at, was this some sort of early form of vaccination?
That's what I was just thinking when you said that about antibodies,
Could they be?
I'm not sure how much it could survive. I'm not sure what the heat temperature is to kill antibodies, but I mean, maybe their fire wasn't hot enough and it just created antibodies in the person, and then they couldn't get tuberculosis,
It's all possible. We don't know because it's hard to forensically go back to look at, as you said, how hot was the fire? What did it actually kill? But here's what Pat and I sort of came to the conclusion of. Somehow it worked, but there also might have been something else, because obviously everybody didn't die. And if the ritual was going on, but here's the other thing. And it was really Pat's idea, and I agreed with him. When there was a vampire scare within a particular family, people would sort of, give them a lot of space. They didn't want, like if it was in the Stoker family, social distancing. So maybe they were scared that somebody else in the family could pass it on or go next door. But you have to also look at housing back in the day. Everybody lived in these teeny little houses. People all slept together in the same rooms. There wasn't lots of rooms. So the social distancing of maybe people gave a wide berth to, the Mercy Brown family or Sarah Tillinghast family. And therefore that's what caused the virus to sort of die out. Who knows? But it was an interesting idea. But let's get back. I get off these tangents because I get excited about this. This article was in Bram's notes. And it basically said that nowadays people are worried about it, are very concerned. A modern day vampire scare. So that must have triggered to Bram, okay, I got this. If I can get people to believe in my story is real and connect it to this. So what did he actually do? Near the 3/4 part of this article, the writer actually mentions, and this guy does, I forget who was the author of the article, but he tied in Charles Darwin's discovery of the vampire bat in South America to the supernatural, the vampire in folklore. So the article was like gold for Bram, Because what Bram was doing is the same thing in his novel. He was utilizing superstition and bringing this Dracula to the shores of England, to Whitby, and bringing him in modern time. You know what Bram did? He actually took some of Charles Darwin's same words, where in the article, he was quoted as saying, when we were in Chile, we noticed these large vampire bats coming out of the trees and drinking blood from the cattle. What Bram did was take almost those same words when Van Helsing in the novel was trying to explain to the band of heroes what is going on. He said, oh yes, Quincy Morris said, when I was in South America, the vampire bats come out of the trees, and one of them drank so much blood out of one of my favorite mares, I had to shoot her, put her down. Which obviously that's a massive exaggeration. They never would take so much blood from a horse and kill it. But Bram was taking poetic license and connecting with the scientist who was respected. Remember, Darwin's Origin of the Species.
Evolution.
That came out in 1859, and it rocked the scientific world. Bram was doing the same thing in Dracula by using Darwin's theory and his discovery by saying, yeah, those vampire bats, that's the real thing. And you got to believe that those things really happen, which is blurring the edges between science and reality to the superstition of the same vampire. So it was masterful. And as you point out, Michael, that article was gold for Bram, and it sits right there in his notes for Dracula in the Rosenbach Museum.
Exactly. And it's kind of freaky because guess what? COVID-19 comes from vampire bats. They're one of the species that has it the most. Because they fly, they keep their body temperature to a certain extent where it doesn't affect them. They're mammals like we are. And that's another theory with the evolution that I believe Bram Stoker looked at, is that Darwin was talking about how we're related to the bat. We're related to the ape. Like we have some genetic traits to them. Even the wolf, we're related to the wolf to a degree. So it's like he's using zoology, to map out this character, this villain, Dracula, or it was called Vampire at the time. But
yeah, it was definitely interesting to look at those notes and to see where he got his information. What did Bram know, and what did he turn into fiction? And that's I keep coming back to, that's my Bible when I'm writing a prequel and a sequel, is looking at all the notes, the secrets behind the writing of Dracula, Bram's motivation, inspiration, and that's what with two different international bestsellers and two different co-authors, Ian and J.D. Dacre, we were taking all that information and saying, okay, how can we spin that in our stories? How can we take real things that happened to Bram Stoker, and in the case of Dracul, his sister, his brother, the doctor, these other members of the family, how can we take that and turn that into a novel that, feels real, feels exactly the same way Dracula did? And I tell you, Michael, it is so satisfying to this day when I look at, reviews on Goodreads and so on. People send me emails, oh my God, your story, I didn't realize that it was, so realistic. How much is real? Yeah. I say, well, read the author's note, but read it at the end, because there is about 60% of it, JD and I use real things. And of course, you have to fictionalize.
I noticed that. I noticed what was real and then what you add a little bit to, as they say. But it's an amazing book. I enjoy it. I read it a lot often, especially around, Halloween. I read it again, and amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. Tell us about Dracula, the name. After I'll let you talk your thing, and then just get us to how we discovered the name Dracula.
Yeah, well, the thing is this: we now know, again, going back to Bram's notes, where he actually found the name Dracula and what attracted him. It is probably one of the most contentious issues in Dracula in the scholarly world, and also in the fan world. I am a member of all kinds of Facebook groups because it makes me smile to see people with all their theories and they don't do any of the research. They just have theories, everybody has a theory, and it's easy to have a theory based on what you have heard from somebody else. This, false news, misinformation, all that stuff. So most people realize that there is some connection.
No. There you are.
Are we okay? Are we good, Michael?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Still alive yet.
Okay.
I can hear you.
All right. So most people believe
there
is
sorry about that. All of a sudden it got a little haywire.
Okay. Most people believe there is some connection between Vlad the Impaler and Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. I think that's, there's no question. What is that connection? What did Bram intend? Where did he get the information? So here's what I know from 12 years of studying and listening to everybody else's opinions. And it takes a little bit, so bear with me as I walk through this. And Michael, ask questions along the way if I haven't described it to help you understand it. So nowhere in the novel Dracula is the name Vlad ever mentioned. Okay, never mentions Vlad, but he does mention Transylvania. But Vlad the Impaler comes from Wallachia, which is the neighboring province. Vlad the Impaler was a ruler, a prince who tried to unify his country to fight off the Ottoman Empire for 7.5 years back in the 1700s. All right. So Bram found 2 books, one of them by William Wilkinson in the Whitby Library, and it was also in the London Library. Those two, that book, same book, 2 different places, mentioned that Dracula means the name devil. Okay. It also means dragon, but Wilkinson didn't know that. It meant devil. And it also was given to somebody who displayed cunning or cruel actions. Now, Bram uses that description in the novel, cunning and cruel actions. So we also know that he took those words from the Wilkinson book and put it into his notes. So that's a given. We know that. We also know that he referenced another book by a guy called James Samuelson, who is actually a very highly respected lawyer and author in London. And this was a recent find. And it's called Romania Past and Present. And in that book, he was basically referenced in his notes something you and I talked about earlier in the show about the Dacians. Bram was looking at the history. He wanted to find a character that had a deep and rich history that he could merge together. So he took a number of different pieces of history stemming back from the Middle Ages, and he took some of Vlad the Impaler's history and shoved it all together to give his Count Dracula a very interesting and dark past. Now, the book by Samuelson does mention that this character, Vlad, was known also as being a devil. And he mentioned some of the history that everybody to this day realizes, that this Vlad created all these atrocities to his own people. If they didn't follow him, he had created all these atrocities to enemies. He even hammered the turbans into the heads of visiting envoys of the Sultan, who were coming to make Vlad basically pay a tribute, a tax, to stop the Ottoman Empire from attacking little old Transylvania. So Bram used, like sort of maybe 30, 40, 50% of the history that surrounds Vlad the Impaler and moved him to Transylvania and stopped him from being a prince and turned him into a count and did this wonderful merger. He also did something else that confuses people to this day, which is use a description of Bran Castle to describe the exterior of Count Dracula's fictional Castle Dracula, but he placed it 400 miles up to the north. To this day, Bran Castle is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Romania, mostly because it's connected to Castle Dracula, which the only connection is I've been there 10 times and I've chatted with the people there, and they're history on social media does say Bram Stoker was inspired by 2 books in the London Library that had sketches of Bran Castle to describe his exterior. It also is a wonderful castle. Queen Marie, who is probably
Beautiful
the
castle.
most famous resident, she was a very benevolent lady. She did wonderful things for the world. Post World War I, Red Cross. She ministered to injured soldiers and so on. So it's loosely connected to Vlad Dracula because it's on the border of Wallachia and Transylvania, and maybe he spent a few days there. Nobody really knows. But the real solid connection is that there was, as I said, a picture, a sketch in the Charles Bonner book and Elizabeth Machiavelli book that Bram Stoker saw. And it's the only sketches of castles that he saw when he was writing Dracula. So that, I believe, when you read his description and you look at those pictures, that's the exterior. Funnily enough, though, Michael, the interior of Castle Dracula is based on a castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland.
I think you saw those big trees. You know those big trees? I think that inspired Bram. Those big trees by the castle.
I don't know which trees you're talking about.
Trees. I always pictured him looking at that painting or that drawing and being inspired by.
Yeah, that's possible, very possible. But
it's by a forest, right? Castle Bran.
Oh, there's forest all around it. It's in a really cool mountain pass, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, that's good.
By a big forest, big beautiful trees, and
yeah.
From what I see when I see people do videos by it.
This is yeah, but you remember, people may take videos now. We only know what Bram Stoker looked at. You know, he didn't see videos back in the day. 2 sketches he looked at. That's it. You know, so yes, nowadays it has beautiful, beautiful trees. Who knows if there's trees there? What we know is what he looked in the book. But he also had access to Emily Gerard's book called Land Beyond the Forest, which is a description, a very vivid description, as was other books that Bram looked at by Charles Bonner, Andrew Cross, Major Johnson, Elizabeth Machiavelli, people who described the forests, just as you said, the landscape of Transylvania. So Bram never went there, but he had very accurate descriptions of these forests, of the superstitions, of what clothes people wore, of the different gypsy ethnic groups, the people that helped helped the Count Dracula elude the band of heroes that Bram described. So he got his ideas.
I remember those guys
from these books.
That's awesome that his creative imagination creates such a bunch of great characters, and the villain, Dracula is the ultimate villain. He's suave, he can seduce the women. That wasn't written. It was almost like a romance novel for its time / horror novel. Some of the stuff he wrote in there wasn't really allowed, right? And some of the publishing.
You got to realize it wasn't too much of a romance novel back in his day. It did have risque stuff, but the romance was turned into the story, introduced to the story by stage and film. When you actually analyze Dracula, yes, there was a little bit of, something going on when Dracula was seducing Mina for her blood, but was it a sexual novel? Not at all. It did have some allusions when Jonathan Harker was having the blood exchange with the women in white.
Oh, no.
That made it somewhat, let's call it, risque and sexy back in the Victorian era, but nothing like what it is nowadays. Now, and even the Dracula, wasn't so suave, debonair aristocrat. He was a guy that looked like something out of the grave, hairy palms, horrible breath. He wasn't Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee. That was introduced later with stage and movies. And it was logical why they had to do that, Michael. Because if you didn't have a handsome guy on stage, nobody's going to come, or they're going to walk out of the theater.
No one's going to watch it.
To see. No, you had to adapt. The story had to be adapted to meet the needs and the desires of the people of the day. So that's why, it doesn't bother me. Some of them I don't necessarily like, what I love is when somebody tries to make something that is faithful to the novel, like the 1977 BBC miniseries with Louis Jourdan is very faithful to the novel. I like the 92 Coppola film. It's not faithful to the novel to the extent the 77 was. It had some
Oh no, it's not.
faithfulness, but it was a complete change. You know, the screenwriter Jim Hart, who is a friend of mine, you know, he says, look, I needed to turn it into a romance story because at the time in 92, that's what we needed to get vampires to sell tickets to the movie. But it wasn't, that's not part of Bram Stoker's novel.
Yeah, because the real vampire legend, he's basically like a zombie. Am I correct? They call him Revenant? Revenant?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They're just a corpse that comes out of the grave.
They're not wearing.
It wasn't attractive or
the
sexy.
black tie. No.
Nothing about it. It was a monster that came out.
Yeah. But as I said, you know, it needed to be adapted to get onto the stage, and it was extraordinarily successful. And it helped book sales, even though Bram died in 1912 and he never saw the, his book come onto stage. Now, he did do a stage reading himself with some of the people from the Lyceum Theater, and that was solely to protect the dramatic rights of the novel. It wasn't supposed to be a stage play. It was just one script passed along and the story read. And that was gold because since he protected the stage rights, when he died and those stage rights reverted to his wife, she was able to work with Hamilton Dean and later John Balston to bring the novel onto stage and make money. And then when they sold those rights, because she was still part of it, to Universal for the Todd Browning film in 1931, she also made money. So she was quite well off after these stage rights that Bram protected were then turned into a contract.
If he could be alive today and see how big it's grown, he'd be so amazed.
I totally agree. You know, he was a a theater manager for Henry Irving at the Lyceum Theater. And I honestly believe that he would have been so excited to have, as we say, a long run. Nowadays we look at Cats and Les Miserables and these other incredible stage productions that go on and on for years. Michael, this is 124 years right now that Dracula's been going on in some version or another.
Incredible.
You know, besides novels and TV series and cartoons and comic book stage costumes, it's been going like crazy. Yeah, breakfast cereal, Count Chocula. I would think Bram would be very proud of what he brought to the world.
Yeah, Blumhouse is taking a crack at it. They have a woman director. It's going to be cool. Yeah. Going to be cool. Yeah. I'm really excited because they did such a wonderful thing with Invisible Man. I can only imagine where they're going to take Dracula, Universal and Blumhouse.
I hope that there is a heavy degree of being faithful to the novel, but I've got a feeling that they're going to, like many others, kind of like the Netflix BBC thing did that Moffat and Gaddis wrote, they're going to go where somebody hasn't gone. There's this seems to be this urge to be creative and to go where nobody has gone with the novel, rather than let's give us a really accurate decryption of the novel, so we know with modern techniques and modern acting, let's bring that book to life. But we'll see. I'm open-minded. We'll see what happens.
I always love it as a play. Nothing beats it as a play, I think, because that actor that has to play Dracula, he has to have charisma. He's telling the Mina, come to me. When it's on stage, it's always great to enjoy as a play, Dracula.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Very powerful. Can be powerful if it's done right.
So, did you do some more research in Transylvania about the Strigoi, about their vampire legends?
No, the only research I've done, although I've been to Transylvania many times, I lead tours over there, is in the, I try to look at the same books that Bram looked at. And I've read many times the Emily Gerard Land Beyond the Forest book. And that's where Bram got information about Strigoi, Nosferatu. Transylvania has to this day, they have very complex mourning rituals. And essentially, any soul that is not at rest has the possibility of coming back as some kind of mischievous creature. They're not always vampire that comes out and horrifies you, but it's mischievous. It does things to try to find its restful place. I mean, hence rest in peace. So they believe that certain rituals have to happen, not just for burial and at burial, but years later to continue to pay respect and to make sure that their dearly departed is resting in peace, so it doesn't come back as some kind of strigoi. And what happens is, authors like Bram take these ideas and take a concept of a spirit that's not at rest and attach different traits and things to it to make it really scary. It's not always as gruesome as a vampire, but it certainly is fertile territory that turned it into one that we all believe today. And it's sort of funny when I go to Transylvania, people who I've got to know very well in the tourist business, when we go to the sites associated with Vlad the Impaler, his different palaces, the different fortresses, or the sites associated with Bram Stoker, you go, oh God, here comes the Stoker guy again. He's the one that turned our famous warrior prince into Count Dracula, the Strigoi. And they say, it's really not like that. I go, I know that. But again, Bram was just taking poetic license. And aren't you lucky that he did, because he's given you a good income stream? And I go, yes, but we want people to know more about our country than we're just vampires. And they go, well, okay, you guys got to work on that. Bram Stoker has done something for you. Now you got to work on other. But really, Transylvania, a province of Romania, is beautiful. It's mountainous. It's got great, outdoor sports, hiking, mountain biking, horseback riding. It's got incredible, beautiful virgin forests. It's got wildflowers. The fruit and vegetables is incredible because it's so plentiful and they don't have to use pesticides. It's one of the last wonderful, unspoiled countries in Europe. And I highly recommend people take a look at it as a potential place to go for an affordable vacation, a nice vacation. And I'll give a plug to my friends at Experience Transylvania, because that's the company that I use as a tour group to organize these trips. We go there, Michael, and we lead people around the country and look at all these places. And I put it in perspective to say, look, this is the real story of Vlad Dracula. This is the real story of Count Dracula. I call it responsible vampire tourism. Know the difference,
right?
And know the similarities.
That's the thing too, is some of the villages there that still have superstition yet to the vampire, and because to them it is a boogeyman. It causes bad luck. If someone dies on the wrong day or is buried the wrong way, they believe that they can come back, as an evil spirit or something to misfortune them.
Yes.
So the boogeyman is
Right.
live and well in some of the Eastern European villages, It's pretty cool how a lot of the vampire myth, just like the werewolf, we could talk about the werewolf. Remember we talked about that, about Dracula and the werewolf legend? There's a Baron Gold.
Yeah, that was
Bram
one of the
took
books.
some notes.
That was one of the books that Bram used as a resource, and I'm convinced that's why Bram actually had integrated into Dracula some of the traits of the vampire, because that really hadn't happened, before. It was an original thing Bram did. He read a book called the Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould, who was actually a priest in England. So he wasn't, some whack job. He was a well-respected writer and a priest who wrote many books about superstitions and mythology, and one of them was the werewolf. And in his stories, he integrated the concept of when it's, the darkness brings potential for evil creatures, the bat, the owl, the wolf, and people would misunderstand. There you go. There's your wolf, man. I love it. And so what Bram actually had is the great scene in the London Zoo in Dracula where the wolf escapes, and that's actually a vampire. That his vampire has hairy palms. Count Dracula does, like the werewolf. So not a lot of people realize this. Bram gets credit for a lot of things, and one of them is that integration of the ability of the vampire to sort of cross over into other folklore, and they cross over like a hybrid, really, of bringing the werewolf into the Dracula story as
the vampire becomes the wolf.
Exactly. Jumping off the boat in Whitby, he doesn't jump off as a wolf, though. He jumps off as a big black dog. And what Bram did was kind of say, hey, it's not always predictable. It just happens that in Yorkshire, which is the county that Whitby is in, they have their own legend of a big black dog running on the moors, being an omen for bad luck. So in Whitby, sure enough, Bram has the black dog jumping up. But in London, they had the berserker, the wolf in the London Zoo. So yeah, and we know as we do research that Transylvania has massive wolf populations and bear populations as well.
I guess that's where they got the fangs. Remember you were telling me about that? The teeth of the wolf?
Yeah. That could that have been where the integration comes from? Because again, that was something that Bram put in the story. Funnily enough, when you look at Bela Lugosi, wasn't till 1958 that the Dracula character could have fangs and blood. Lugosi didn't have fangs. Nope. Christopher Lee in 58 had fangs and blood in his mouth because the censors were very sensitive to horrifying people too much.
Yeah, that's what I always tell people. I'm like, in legend, the vampire just had regular teeth, actually. Whatever he had is what he munched on you with. And then later, some of the characteristics, as you know, with maybe Varney the Vampire and Dracula, had pointed canines, and then that eventually became fangs.
Real fangs. So that I'm sure it came from the wolf. So a good possibility that it did.
Because he's constantly sliding up and down the evolution scale in the movie. He's getting from old to young, into bat to wolf, because that's, like you said, that's where Darwin fits in when he did all those lectures at museums and stuff,
Yeah, where does the vampire fit in, in human evolution? It's very animalistic, but also he's immortal, so he's very advanced. So it's like this scale. Where is he? He's a supernatural creature, so he doesn't actually follow natural law, even though Darwin is trying to, identify him. Bram has got Van Helsing saying, wait a sec, I'm a scientist, as is Dr. Seward, but also I understand mythology and supernatural. So even though we're dying to say, what is it? I want proof. What is it? I want scientific proof, as Dr. Seward did in parts of Van Helsing. But when Van Helsing explained to the band of heroes, thus his readers, you can't explain it, and there was this great quote in the story, I want you to believe, as Van Helsing said to Seward and the rest, I want you to believe. Believe in what? Believe in things you know to be untrue.
Yep.
You can't explain it because of science.
It's outside the box of normal thinking, of rationale.
Exactly.
That's probably why the legend still exists to this day, because there's still things occurring, cattle mutilations. People are seeing these things, and it's just like what happened Highgate Cemetery. Remember, people were seeing what they thought were dead bodies coming out of the cemetery. So there's still these things that are beyond our understanding still occurring to this day that keeps the vampire or werewolf legend, that stuff keeps going just because of these sightings and stuff,
Yeah, and you can't, it's hard to differentiate between somebody who's just making up the story to get publicity versus, the unknown. And so it all gets lumped into one big pile. It's stuff we can't explain. And so since you can't explain it, you can't discount it. Just say, okay, maybe that's true. Just like any kind of paranormal investigation. Some people claim to have a gift, that they're sensitive to spirits, spiritualism. Yeah, that's possible. I don't discount it. I like to keep an open mind too. But until, our present world and what our scientific capabilities are, until they can prove things definitively, the best thing to do is keep an open mind and keep the possibilities open.
Exactly. And did you discover how he came up with the weakness for the vampire? Because I know sunlight, Dracula originally could come out in the daylight. He just didn't have as much abilities, I guess I'd say, right? Is that correct?
There was nothing. That's right. There was nothing in any of the books, the Gerard books, about the weakness. That does say that there's certain traits that he couldn't cross moving water, but there was nothing about sunlight. I think the sunlight thing, because in Bram's rules, the vampire could exist in sunlight. He just didn't have power. My personal theory is that Bram looked at these creatures of the night that are things that create superstition because they can't be explained. In daytime, you can see things and we can understand what's going on, but at nighttime, you really can't because it's dark. There's no 1700s. There's no electric lights around. In rural areas for people to just turn the light. We can see what it is. What's that noise? What killed that creature? Was it a supernatural creature, or was it just a fox breaking into the hen house? But it's just all this. People think the worst. So who knows? I like to keep an open mind and just say it's all possible. Where does it come from? I don't know. Bram decided to have a vampire that had weakness at daytime, but F.W. Murnau decided in Nosferatu to have the vampire basically blow up or melt in light, and other people have gone and done the same. So that's cool. It all works.
Because I know some legends, some came out during midday or something in the afternoon and attacked people. Like in Poland and Hungary, they had a superstition that certain times of the year, certain holidays, they could come out of their graves, like even during the afternoon, and just start attacking people.
Ooh, I don't know about that one. That sounds cool. That's scary because then you're never safe.
Yeah, I know. They I noticed that True Blood switched things up, like with silver, and that's usually related more with werewolves. But I noticed that it's been slipping into the vampire legend more now. I don't know if Bram Stoker looked into that at all. Silver, the purity of silver.
No, he didn't. There was nothing in his notes about that. So much of this, Michael, is different authors that want to do something original, that add it because they say, "Oh, this is a vampire, different," and originality is good. You don't get tired of the same old, and I think it's fine. Big time writers like Anne Rice and Stephen King and Charlene Harris, excuse me. They all add something cool to the genre that makes it a little bit unique and different, and it gives us pause. What do those vampires do? And it's all good. So, Michael, I've just got a couple minutes left. Are there any other questions you've got to ask me? Hit me with a couple so we don't leave any off the table.
Sure. Is there anything new that you learned about the vampire legend that you'd like to share with us? Any new traits or anything else that in your research?
Geez, no. I can't think of. I haven't found any more countries where they are prevalent. I haven't found anything to really share with people other than the books that Bram listed in the back of his notes as his research books for Dracula have been discovered in the London Library. And what I found was very cool was a Dr. Herbert Mayo, that the Mayo family that ended up creating the Mayo Clinic, in modern days. This is a medical family. He wrote a book about popular superstitions. And in that book, he had a whole chapter on vampirism, on ghosts, true ghosts, symbolism. So here was a respected medical doctor that Bram read a book about that had all this information about vampirism and alluding to the fact that it was possibly believable and true. So not necessarily a trait that I found, but I have found that Bram's confidence, I think, was boosted not just by finding Emily Gerard's Land Beyond the Forest and real superstition that she claimed was superstition, but a doctor that was looking into this as well.
That's so cool.
That is cool. and it gives an an ounce more credibility to what Bram was trying to do and what JD and I were trying to do in Dracul. This story could be real, could be based
almost
on real
based
stuff.
on a true story before that was a thing.
Exactly. That's the whole point. So he found those books that gave him confidence to write Dracula. That gave JD Barker and I great confidence to make Dracul feel eerily and strangely realistic.
That's so cool. So hear that, guys. Dracula could be based on a true story, based on what they found. That's amazing, amazing stuff. And make sure to check out the book Dracul. And then what was the other one that you made?
Dracula the Undead.
Dracula the Undead.
That's a continuation of Dracula. And as I said, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and that's what I've kind of used to my advantage, as did Bram. You can find me on dacrestoker.com. Follow me on Facebook. You can also go to bramstokerestate.com because that's where all my books are for sale. I sell signed copies, and that's lots of good resources about my family and Bram Stoker at bramstokerestate.com. Enjoy that. Follow me on Facebook for my tours to England, Ireland, Scotland, Pennsylvania. Next year is the 125th anniversary of Dracula, and I'm leading a tour to some of these places where Bram was inspired in Whitby and where he wrote the book in Cruden Bay, and with this company, Experience Transylvania, to see places in Romania that are really cool associated with Vlad Dracula and Count Dracula. Thank you, Michael, for having me on your show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate having you on, Dacre. And everybody, make sure hit subscribe and like our videos. And please donate to the Indiegogo campaign for Halloween Evil Lives in memory of my late best friend, Jarrett. We can get it done. Another great guest, guys. Thank you, Dacre. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, guys. All right, take care. Bye, Tiffany.
Yep, bye.
Hope to meet you one day.
Right, Tiffany. Bye. See, I told you. Told you, Tiffany. Have a good day, Dacre. Appreciate it.
Okay. Yep, bye.
Yep.